A tense parking lot standoff takes a shocking turn when a racist woman's hatred pushes her over the line, and the consequences are unforgettable. Desmond Cole eased his car into the grocery store parking lot, the afternoon sun glinting off windshields as shoppers bustled in and out. It was a busy Saturday, the kind where every free space was a coveted prize. He spotted an open spot near the entrance, rare on a day like this, and carefully maneuvered in, making sure his car was perfectly aligned. As he stepped out, the sharp screech of tires made him pause. A white SUV jerked to a stop in the adjacent spot, its driver's window rolling down before the engine was even off. Behind the wheel sat a middle-aged woman with a face twisted in fury. "Hey!" she barked, jabbing her finger at him as if commanding obedience. "That was my spot." Desmond blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the venom in her voice. "Excuse me?" he replied, his tone calm but firm. The woman slammed her door and stormed toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Heads began to turn as her voice rose above the hum of the busy lot. "I had my blinker on. That was my spot," she snapped, her words laced with indignation. Desmond took a measured breath, scanning the scene. He hadn't seen anyone waiting when he pulled in, and the lane had been clear. "I didn't notice anyone," he said evenly. "The space was open when I parked." His calm response seemed to ignite her fury further. Her arms crossed tightly as her glare sharpened. "Of course you didn't notice," she hissed, her tone dripping with condescension. "You people never do." Desmond felt a familiar weight settle on his chest, the kind of pressure that came with encounters like these. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, sharp, cutting, and full of intent. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was no longer about a parking spot, it was something far uglier. "Ma'am," he began, keeping his tone calm despite the storm brewing in her eyes. "I'm just here to buy groceries. If there was any misunderstanding, I apologize, but this really isn't worth getting upset over." His restraint only seemed to enrage her further. She stepped closer, her face inches from his, jabbing a finger toward his chest. "Oh, don't you dare act like the victim," she snapped. "You people think you can walk into our neighborhoods and do whatever you want, taking what doesn't belong to you, ruining everything." Her voice climbed, each word louder and more venomous than the last, drawing even more attention from the onlookers. Desmond clenched his fists by his sides, every instinct screaming at him to respond, to stand his ground. But he knew better. He'd seen how these situations played out, especially for men like him. One wrong move, one raised voice, and the narrative would twist against him in an instant. Keeping his voice measured, he replied, "Where I live, or where you think I live, has nothing to do with this." His words were steady, but her expression darkened, her lip curling into a sneer. "Of course it does." She spat, her voice dripping with malice. "This is what happens when they let people like you into nice areas. You think you can just take whatever you want, but not here, not today." Her words cut deeper than he expected, carrying the weight of generations of prejudice. Desmond glanced around, noticing the small crowd that had gathered, faces watching, phones out, but no one stepping in. The knot in his chest tightened. He had to end this before it spiraled further. Desmond took a step back, his eyes locking onto hers as he fought to keep his composure. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble," he said firmly. "It's just a parking spot." But her fury only deepened, her face twisting into a mask of unrestrained rage. "Trouble? You think this is about a parking spot?" she shrieked, her voice piercing through the parking lot like a siren. "You people are nothing but trouble. You don't belong here. You don't deserve to be here." She shoved a finger at his chest again, her hand trembling with anger. The crowd grew larger, murmurs rippling through as her words escalated. Desmond felt every gaze on him, judging him, waiting for him to react. "Walk away," he told himself silently, even as her insults cut deeper. Just then she lunged forward, shoving him with both hands. The force caught him off guard, and he stumbled back, barely keeping his balance. His patience snapped. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice sharp but controlled. The woman, unfazed by his reaction, crossed her arms and glared at him with disdain. "What's wrong with you?" she spat. "You think you can walk away after what you've done? I've had enough of people like you ruining everything." Desmond's jaw tightened as he forced himself to breathe, to think clearly. "I'm warning you," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. "Walk away before you do something you'll regret." But instead of backing down, she took another step closer, her eyes alight with malice. "You don't get to tell me what to do, boy!" she hissed, her words slicing through the air like a blade. The crowd, once quiet murmurs, began to shift uncomfortably, some pulling out phones to record. Desmond felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew the stakes, knew how easily this could turn against him, yet his chest burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He clenched his fists, determined not to give her what she wanted. The situation reached a boiling point when, without warning, the woman lashed out, her hands swinging through the air with startling speed. The slap landed hard across Desmond's face, the sting radiating through his cheek as her fury echoed in the crack of skin meeting skin. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The crowd stood in stunned silence, their murmurs vanishing as the sheer audacity of her actions settled in. Desmond's head turned slightly from the force, his chest heaving as he processed what had just happened. It wasn't just the physical blow. It was the humiliation, the dehumanization, the belief in her entitlement to act with impunity. Slowly, he turned back to face her, his cheek still burning. She stood there, triumphant, her lips curling into a smirk as if daring him to retaliate. "What are you going to do about it?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Desmond's fists unclenched and he straightened his posture. His voice was cold and deliberate when he finally spoke. "You've crossed the line!" Before she could react, he raised his hand, not with fury, but with precision, and slapped her back. The crowd gasped as her body jerked backward, her hand instinctively flying to her cheek. His action wasn't born out of rage but out of resolve, a refusal to let her strip him of his dignity without consequence. The slap wasn't meant to harm but to make a statement. He wouldn't be her victim. She stumbled slightly, her expression twisting into one of shock and disbelief, as if the very idea of being held accountable was foreign to her. You hit me!" she shrieked, her voice a mix of outrage and desperation. Her wide eyes darted to the gathering crowd, seeking validation. "Did you all see that? He assaulted me! This thug hit me!" Her voice grew louder, shriller, but Desmond stood firm, unshaken by her theatrics even as the weight of the moment pressed on him. The insult lingered like a storm cloud, oppressive and suffocating, wrapping the air in a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Marcus's breath stalled, his chest tightening as if bound by an invisible grip. His fists curled instinctively, the sharp sting of his nails against his palms the only thing grounding him. It wasn't just her words, it was the sneer in her voice, the confidence that came from a lifetime of unchecked privilege. This wasn't a petty argument anymore. It was a calculated strike, each word dripping with malice and centuries of entitlement that she wielded without hesitation. Around them, onlookers hovered at a distance, their eyes darting between him and her, silent witnesses to an unspoken narrative they were already piecing together. Marcus felt their judgment pressing on him, a weight far heavier than her insult. Yet, despite the fire burning inside him, he stood still, knowing that even the smallest misstep would only validate every vile assumption she carried in her heart. Desmond's breath hitched as his fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. The issue was no longer about a parking spot. It was a matter of power, entitlement, and her belief that she could act without consequence. For a fleeting moment, Desmond thought about walking away, letting the situation dissolve. But the weight of her words, the shove, and everything else that had been simmering inside him felt ready to explode. And then, it happened. Without warning, her hand shot through the air, fast and sharp, striking him across the face. The slap echoed, bouncing off the surrounding cars, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The force of the blow snapped his head to the side, the sting spreading across his cheek like wildfire. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the humiliation, a public attempt to strip him of his dignity. Desmond stood frozen, trying to process what had just occurred. It wasn't merely a slap, it was a statement that she could degrade him and walk away unscathed. Every muscle in Desmond's body tightened, urging him to react. He knew what was expected of him, but the fire inside wouldn't let him remain passive. He couldn't just take it. Before he could fully think, his hand moved, controlled, firm, deliberate. He slapped her back, not with the same force, but with enough intention to make his point clear. It wasn't retaliation. It was a restrained warning that he wouldn't be anyone's punching bag. Samantha stumbled back, clutching her cheek in disbelief. Her eyes widened, as if facing consequences was a foreign concept. "You hit me!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "You animal, do you know who I am? You'll regret this!" Her arms flailed as she turned red with rage. Scanning the crowd, she pointed at him, her voice escalating. "He hit me! Did you all see that? He thinks he can hit a woman! You're finished!" Desmond felt the weight of the onlookers' stares, the murmurs and judgment mounting. Phones appeared, recording every moment. His pulse raced as the situation threatened to spiral out of control. "I didn't want trouble," he said, steady despite the adrenaline. "But you hit me first." Samantha hissed through clenched teeth, her hand still pressed to her cheek as if she were the victim of some unforgivable crime. Her glare burned with venom, her pride bruised. Desmond's voice dropped, cold and firm. "I'm not doing this with you. I'm done." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked away, his heart thudding in his chest. His cheek still stung, not just from the slap, but from the weight of the confrontation. Behind him, Samantha's screams grew more frantic, incoherent, her fury boiling over. "You're done! You hear me! You're finished!" she shouted, her voice rising and falling like a broken siren. But Desmond didn't look back. The automatic doors of the grocery store slid open, offering him a brief escape from the chaos. Inside, he was met with the cool hum of air conditioning and the soft murmur of shoppers, discussing weekend plans in peaceful oblivion. It was a world untouched by the storm he'd just weathered. Yet, Samantha's voice lingered in his mind, relentless and echoing, impossible to shut out. Gripping the shopping cart's handle tightly, Desmond's knuckles whitened as he tried to steady the storm raging within him. Every aisle passed felt like a blur, his mind trapped in a loop, replaying the confrontation. The sting on his cheek was a reminder, but it wasn't the slap that cut the deepest. It was her words, sharp and venomous, echoing in his mind. Boy, the word hung there, each syllable dripping with disdain. No matter how many times he faced people like Samantha, the sting of their malice and entitlement was always the same. He should have walked away earlier, he knew that. But it was always the same. People like her believed they could do and say whatever they wanted because of who they were and because of who he was. It was exhausting, walking that thin line between silence and standing his ground. Either way, it felt like he could never win. His thoughts scattered as he reached for a loaf of bread, his hand hovering midair. His focus wasn't on the bread, it was still with her. In the parking lot, with the insults and the slap. He remembered the crowd, their shifting glances, the subtle judgment falling on him, not her. He knew what they saw, a black man in conflict with a white woman. Her wild accusations, her shrill voice, and her gesturing had worked like magic. Placing the bread into the cart, Desmond moved forward, the weight of it all bearing down on him. But the farther he walked, the angrier he became. This anger wasn't fleeting, it was cold, the kind that had settled into his bones long ago, born from a lifetime of judgment, stares, and exclusion. It wasn't just about Samantha, the parking spot, or the slap. It was about how she had treated him from the start, as if his very presence was an offense, as if his existence itself had been a violation. Desmond grabbed the carton of milk a little too forcefully, placing it in his cart with a harsh motion. Taking a deep breath, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He'd dealt with people like Samantha before, and he knew he'd face more in the future. But today, something about it felt different, heavier. Her words and actions had dug deeper into him than usual. He had tried to walk away, to avoid conflict, but the shove, the slap, it all felt like a line had been crossed. The sting of slapping her back didn't come from guilt, but from the understanding of how she'd twist the situation, how she'd turn it around, scream louder, and play the victim. It wasn't out of anger that he'd struck her. It was a reflex, a loss of control. Yet in her hands it would be turned into something monstrous, a tool to attack him. As Desmond continued down the aisles, loading his cart with groceries, a thought gnawed at him. What if the situation had been reversed? What if he had started it? What if he'd thrown the first slap? Would anyone have believed his side? Would the crowd have seen him the same way, or would they have turned on him, casting him as the aggressor? He pushed the thought aside, but it clung to him as he approached the checkout. The cashier smiled at him, oblivious to the tension inside. Desmond gave a strained nod, swiped his card, and grabbed his bags, his mind still reeling. As he stepped toward the exit, dread settled in his stomach. Was Samantha still out there? What had she done? When he entered the parking lot, something felt wrong. His heart sank as he approached his car, and the damage became clear. Deep, long scratches lined the side of his car, as if someone had deliberately keyed it. Desmond stopped, fists tightening. It had to be Samantha, there was no question. He ran his fingers along the fresh gouges, knowing she had done this while he was inside, probably savoring her petty victory. He could almost hear her mocking voice in his head, her smug tone feeling untouchable. The anger swelled again, stronger now. This wasn't just about words, this was personal. It was something tangible, something he'd have to fix, and it would cost him. For a moment he thought about calling the police. but the thought froze him. He knew how this could go. She'd twist it, make him the villain, and there'd be no one to back him up. Desmond's frustration boiled over as he stood by his car, refusing to let the incident slide. He wasn't about to back down, not this time, not when people like Samantha thought they could get away with anything. He leaned against his car, mind racing, as the minutes dragged on. 15 minutes passed in silence before the sound of mocking laughter broke through the tension. Looking up, Desmond saw Samantha, leaning against her SUV, an irritating smirk plastered on her face. She had been watching the whole time. "Ah, poor thing," she sneered, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Looks like someone's car got messed up. Maybe you shouldn't have taken my spot." Desmond's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he held his ground, staring her down. "You find this funny?" Samantha's laughter grew louder, clearly enjoying herself. "I think it's hilarious." "What, are you going to call the cops?" "Go ahead. They'll take my side and arrest you. You people never seem to learn." Her words stung, each one fanning the flames of his rage. Desmond fought the urge to lash out, knowing that reacting would only escalate things. He had to remain composed. But this was different. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. Stepping toward her, he opened his mouth, but before he could say a word, she taunted. "Go ahead! Say something, I dare you." Desmond paused. He could easily put her in her place, tear her arrogance apart, but he knew that playing into her hand would make everything worse. Then, just as unexpectedly, she climbed into her SUV, still grinning at him through the open window. For a second, Desmond thought she might finally leave, but instead, she threw her car into reverse and slammed it right into his. The sickening sound of metal crunching echoed in the parking lot as the rear of her SUV collided with his front bumper. She looked back at him, still laughing, before speeding off, leaving him standing there in shock. The damage was undeniable now. This wasn't just a slap, it was personal. Desmond's hand shook as he reached for his phone. He couldn't let this slide. He dialed the police, his breath shallow from the shock of the impact. The crash still rang in his ears as frustration built up in his chest. He had tried to remain calm, to walk away, but she kept pushing. The phone rang, and when the operator answered, Desmond swallowed his anger, forcing his voice to stay even. "I need to report an incident," he said, his voice steady despite the fury bubbling inside. Desmond's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he kept his eyes locked on Samantha's SUV, the tension from their earlier encounter still buzzing in his veins. He gritted his teeth and dialed the police. "A woman deliberately hit my car and took off," he said, his voice low but steady. He rattled off the details, the make of the vehicle, the color, and their location as his car hummed quietly behind hers. His heart pounded, and though every instinct screamed to let it go, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. He needed to follow through now. Desmond's gaze remained fixed on the rear of her SUV as they navigated the calm suburban streets. He knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral, how easily his story could be twisted. But today, this was different. He wasn't going to be the one walking away with his pride shattered. When the flashing blue lights of a police car appeared up ahead, Desmond exhaled with some relief. Samantha's SUV was slowing down, pulled over by the authorities. He parked at a safe distance, taking a moment before getting out. His hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush, but there was no turning back. He had made the call, and now it was time to face the consequences. He watched as officers stepped out of their vehicle, Samantha already gesturing wildly inside her car. Even from a distance, her exaggerated movements and tone were unmistakable. She was framing herself as the victim. Desmond exhaled sharply, his thoughts crystal clear. He had to keep his cool now. "He's the one who attacked me!" Samantha's voice rang out, sharp and accusatory, as she pointed in his direction. "He followed me! He's stalking me! Someone arrest him!" Desmond's stomach churned with the familiar sting of injustice, but he wasn't backing down this time. This wasn't just her word against his. There were witnesses, and the truth would be told. As the officers moved toward him, one of them, Officer Carter, turned and asked in a neutral tone, "Can you tell me what happened?" "I apologize for repeating the same phrasing, and I appreciate your patience. Let me try again with a more original rewrite of that part." Desmond took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "I was in the parking lot when she started yelling at me over a spot. The situation quickly escalated when she pushed me and slapped me. After that, she keyed my car while I was inside the store. I tried to leave, but she wouldn't let it go. Just moments ago, she deliberately crashed her SUV into my car and sped off." Desmond's fists tightened at the accusation, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Officer, My car is damaged, he said calmly. You can see the scratches. She just hit me, too. Officer Carter turned his attention to Desmond's vehicle, his gaze sharp as he noted the damage. We'll inspect it, he replied, then addressed Samantha. Ma'am, please exit the vehicle. Samantha's face flushed, her hands pounding the steering wheel in frustration. Are you serious? She shouted. You're actually listening to him? Look at me. I'm the victim here. Arrest him now. Officer Carter's tone grew more commanding. Please get out of the vehicle, ma'am. Samantha's angry eyes locked onto Desmond, her expression seething with rage. This is his fault, she spat, voice dripping with venom. You people are all the same. Desmond clenched his jaw, determined not to rise to her bait. He knew her game, push him, provoke him, make him the villain. But this time he wouldn't play along. With a dramatic gesture, Samantha yanked the door open and stormed out of her SUV, continuing her rant. This is absurd. I'm not the criminal here. He's the one who should be arrested. The officer stayed calm, guiding her away to ask further questions. Samantha's voice, shrill and frantic, continued, accusing Desmond of attacking her and painting herself as the victim. Desmond stood nearby, the weight of her relentless accusations bearing down on him. It was a familiar frustration, but this time he wasn't isolated. Others could see the truth too. A second officer approached Desmond, requesting a detailed account of the events. Desmond inhaled deeply, recounting every moment, from the initial insult to the escalation, and finally, the intentional crash into his car. Were there witnesses to the first part of the confrontation? The officer asked. Desmond shook his head. There were people, but no one intervened. I'm not sure if anyone recorded it. The officer nodded thoughtfully. We'll check the store's surveillance footage to verify. As for the damage, it speaks for itself. Before Desmond could add anything, Samantha's voice cut through again. He's lying! Don't believe him! He's making this all up! Desmond's body tensed as Officer Carter returned, his demeanor calm yet focused. Ma'am, Officer Carter said, his tone firm as he addressed Samantha. Based on the evidence, we're placing you under arrest for property damage and assault. You'll need to come with us. Samantha's face flushed bright red, her body shaking with fury. Arrest me? Are you insane? She screamed, pointing at Desmond with trembling fingers. He should be the one in cuffs. I'm the victim here. Please turn around, ma'am, Officer Carter said again, stepping closer. Before he could finish, Samantha let out a loud, piercing scream and lunged at Desmond. Her fists slammed into his shoulder, catching him off guard. The strike wasn't hard, but the fact that she'd attacked him right in front of the police left him stunned. You think you can destroy me? Samantha hissed, swinging again. This time her knuckles barely brushed his chest, but the venom behind her movements was undeniable. Her face twisted in a furious, ugly grimace. The officers acted swiftly, seizing her arms before she could land another blow. Samantha, now completely unhinged, flailed wildly, her voice a torrent of rage. You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. You don't belong here. Desmond instinctively stepped back, his pulse quickening as the officers struggled to contain her. Her kicks and thrashing made it hard to restrain her, but they eventually managed to get the cuffs on. I'm the victim, she yelled, her voice cracking as they dragged her toward the squad car. You'll regret this! I'll have your jobs. You can't do this to me. Officer Carter remained calm, tightening his grip on her as they moved her toward the car. Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault and property damage. This ends here. Even as she was shoved into the back seat, Samantha continued to scream, her eyes burning with hate as she glared at Desmond through the window. You haven't won! She spat, her voice muffled but still full of venom. I'll ruin you, mark my words! The door slammed shut, cutting off her words, and as the police car pulled away, Desmond remained frozen, his chest heavy with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Officer Carter approached him again, his earlier sternness replaced by a gentler demeanor. Are you okay, sir? He asked. Desmond nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the chaos. His shoulder throbbed where she'd struck him, but it was nothing compared to the emotional weight of what had just unfolded. Samantha's unrelenting hostility, the fact that she'd attacked him in front of the officers, he was still trying to process it all. I'm fine, Desmond said, his voice tight, betraying the exhaustion from the ordeal. Thank you. We'll take your statement, Officer Carter said, handing Desmond a card. You can come by the station tomorrow if you wish to file formal charges. Desmond nodded, still feeling the weight of the altercation. I will, he muttered, the events of the confrontation lingering in his mind. As the officers departed, their sirens fading into the distance, Desmond stood alone by his damaged vehicle. He stared at the dents and scratches, the physical evidence of Samantha's wrath. This wasn't merely about the car or the insults. It had become a matter of principle, of standing up for himself and refusing to let people like Samantha believe they could act without facing repercussions. Although he hadn't started this conflict, he was determined to see it through to the end. The following day, Desmond entered the police station, the events from the day before still fresh in his thoughts. While the tension in his chest hadn't fully dissipated, the bustling atmosphere of the station offered him an odd sense of calm. He knew what he had to do, ensure that Samantha was held responsible for her actions. A young officer at the front desk greeted him with a professional tone. "Good morning, sir. How can I assist you today?" Desmond replied. "I'd like to file charges for an incident that took place yesterday. There was an assault and damage to my property. I gave a statement, but I want to proceed with formal charges." The officer nodded and handed him a form. "Please fill this out, and someone will be with you shortly." As Desmond filled out the paperwork, his mind wandered back to the confrontation with Samantha, the shouting, the blows, the hostility that had consumed her. The memory felt as vivid as if it had just happened. He found himself wondering how the situation might have unfolded differently if the officers hadn't been present to witness the truth. Samantha had tried to rewrite the story, to shift blame, but now her lies had crumbled. There was no escaping the truth anymore. "Mr. Cole?" A familiar voice broke his thoughts. Desmond looked up to see Officer Carter. "Yes, that's me," Desmond answered, rising from his seat. Officer Carter gestured for him to follow. "Let's finalize your statement and talk about the next steps." Desmond followed him into a small office, where the officer sat at a desk, pulling up the necessary files. "So, you've decided to move forward with charges against Miss Greene?" Officer Carter asked, looking up from his computer. Officer Carter looked up briefly as he typed. "So, you've decided to go ahead with charges against Miss Greene?" Desmond responded with a firm nod. "Yes. She needs to answer for what she did." Carter leaned back in his chair, giving a small nod of approval. "I think you're making the right decision. We have enough evidence, your car's damage, witness statements, and the assault that happened in front of the officers to build a strong case." Desmond felt a sense of reassurance settle over him. This was no longer just a minor incident, it was about holding Samantha accountable for the damage she had caused. Despite her threats, she would now face the consequences of her own actions. While Officer Carter continued his work, Desmond's attention was briefly distracted by a loud noise from down the hall. His gaze shifted toward the sound, but he refocused as Officer Carter spoke once more. "We'll submit this report to the district attorney's office. They'll review everything. The witness statements, the damage, and the assault in front of the officers and determine what to do next. With all the evidence we have, this case is solid." Desmond nodded, feeling some relief for the first time in days. The path to justice was clear, and it gave him a sense of calm amidst the chaos. However, just as he began to feel grounded, a shrill voice echoed from the hall, filled with fury. "You can't do this to me!" Samantha's voice was sharp and enraged. Before Desmond could react, the door flew open, and Samantha stormed in, being held back by an officer. Her face was flushed with anger, her hair disheveled, and her eyes blazing as she struggled to break free. "You!" she screamed, her gaze locking onto Desmond with burning hatred. "You're ruining my life! This is all your fault!" She lunged forward, but the officer in front of her blocked the way, stepping between her and Desmond. "I'll destroy you!" Samantha shouted, her voice getting louder. "You think you can get away with this? I'll sue you, you piece of trash! You'll regret this!" Desmond stood, his heart racing, but he remained calm. Another officer arrived to assist, pulling Samantha back into the hallway as her angry shouts faded. "He's here for her arraignment," Officer Carter muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't expect her to be brought in so early." Desmond slowly sat back down, trying to steady his nerves. Even in custody, Samantha's sense of entitlement hadn't changed, and it was clear she wasn't going to back down easily. Officer Carter could see Desmond was still uneasy, so he reassured him. "You don't need to worry," he said confidently. "She won't escape the consequences. Once the charges are fully processed, she'll have a lot more to deal with than just this first hearing." Desmond exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly at the officer's words. Samantha's cruel remarks still echoed in his mind, but he knew now wasn't the time to let her get under his skin. Carter continued, his voice steady. "We've got everything covered. Soon you'll have a clear picture of what comes next. You've done the right thing coming forward." Desmond nodded and stood up, offering his thanks. "I appreciate your help." Carter gave a brief nod. "That's what I'm here for. Good luck. We'll keep you updated." The cool morning air hit Desmond as he stepped outside, and he felt a complex blend of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also a quiet determination. He had taken the necessary steps, filed the charges, but the real fight was just beginning. Days passed, and finally the trial arrived. The courtroom felt thick with expectation, and Desmond found himself sitting in the gallery, his heart calm though his thoughts ran wild. As the judge entered, the air shifted and a hush spread across the room. Samantha sat at the defense table, her demeanor stiff, eyes fixed ahead in a defiant stare. She wouldn't acknowledge him, but the animosity was palpable. To her, this whole situation seemed like a misunderstanding, a narrative she clung to even though the truth was clear. Desmond steeled himself, focusing on the facts at hand. This trial was no longer about petty disputes or broken property. It was about ensuring that Samantha faced the consequences of her actions. She had physically attacked him, caused damage to his property, and tried to twist the story to suit her. Now, the facts would come to light. As the judge took her place, the door creaked, signaling her arrival. The bailiff called, "All rise," and the room stood in unison. Judge Naomi Harris exuded authority, and her reputation for fairness was well known. "You may be seated," she commanded, and the room complied. The prosecution began, outlining the charges against Samantha: assault, property damage, and disorderly conduct. Desmond leaned forward, focusing intently on the prosecutor, a Wallace whose sharp voice cut through the tension in the courtroom. "Mr. Cole was simply going about his day," she said, addressing the jury with precision. "He did nothing to provoke this attack." Ms. Greene, however, escalated the situation, damaging his vehicle and physically assaulting him twice. And this happened in full view of witnesses and law enforcement. Her calm, commanding tone filled the room as she drove her point home. "We are here today because Miss Greene must face the consequences of her actions." Then came Samantha's lawyer, a man with graying hair and a soft demeanor, clearly attempting to humanize her. "Ms. Greene deeply regrets what occurred," he began, gesturing toward Samantha, who sat stiffly beside him. "She acted out of frustration, but she is not the villain this case portrays. She's a mother, a valued member of her community, and someone who simply had a bad day, a day that spiraled out of control." He paused, letting his words linger as his tone shifted to appeal to the jury. "We ask you to consider the immense pressure she was under, and to approach this with compassion, understanding that this was a one-time incident." Desmond felt his jaw tighten as he listened, his chest filling with restrained frustration. Compassion, that word always seemed reserved for people like Samantha, who expected sympathy no matter how destructive their actions. For people like him, there was no such grace, only judgment and harsh scrutiny. The trial progressed with witness testimonies from bystanders who had been in the parking lot. Several people took the stand, recounting the heated argument between Desmond and Samantha. Each account painted a consistent picture: Samantha's fury, the verbal abuse she hurled, and how she escalated it into physical violence. Their statements aligned perfectly with Desmond's story, corroborating the police report. The prosecutor's steady line of questioning revealed the truth piece by piece, leaving little doubt about what had transpired. Finally, Samantha was called to testify. She approached the stand with an air of defiance, her chin high despite the weight of the accusations. Taking her seat, she clasped her hands tightly, her lawyer standing ready to guide her narrative. "Ms. Greene," he began gently, "can you tell us what happened on the day of the incident?" Samantha let out a dramatic sigh, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was having a really bad day," she began. "I went to the store, and when I saw that parking spot, I thought things might finally go right for me. But then Mr. Cole pulled in, and I lost my temper. I regret how I acted after that." Her lawyer nodded as though empathizing with her plight. "And why do you regret it?" he asked, leading her forward. "I regret losing my temper," she said, her voice soft but calculated. Then, as if flipping a switch, her tone hardened. "But what no one seems to understand is that Mr. Cole slapped me too. I wasn't the only one who escalated things. He hit me back." Desmond braced himself as her words hung in the air. This was the twist he had anticipated, the inevitable attempt to shift blame and cast herself as the victim. Samantha's lawyer seized the opportunity, addressing the jury with a sympathetic tone. "Ms. Greene acknowledges her actions," he said, "but we cannot ignore that Mr. Cole also became physical." This was not a one-sided altercation. The room stirred with murmurs, the jury exchanging glances as doubt flickered across their faces. Samantha's lawyer returned to his seat, clearly satisfied with the seeds he'd attempted to plant, but Wallace was already on her feet, her confidence unshaken. She strode toward the stand with a determined focus, ready to dismantle Samantha's narrative. "Miss Greene," she began, her voice sharp and deliberate, "you claim Mr. Cole slapped you. But isn't it true that this only happened after you struck him first?" Samantha's defiance faltered for a moment, her gaze flickering to her lawyer. "Yes, but," she began, only to be cut off. "And isn't it true," Wallace pressed, her tone unrelenting, "that Mr. Cole's response was not an act of aggression, but a reflex to defend himself from your assault?" Samantha hesitated, the cracks in her story growing more visible. "I suppose it was a reaction," she admitted reluctantly, her voice losing its edge. Wallace nodded, her expression firm, and turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just heard confirms what the evidence already shows. Mr. Cole did not initiate this confrontation. He merely responded to the violence directed at him." Wallace rose with purpose, her sharp gaze locking onto Samantha as she approached. "Ms. Greene," she began, her tone slicing through the courtroom silence. "You claim Mr. Cole slapped you. But isn't it true that his action only came after you struck him first?" Samantha shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the confidence she had clung to visibly faltering. "Yes, but he still hit me," she replied, her voice defensive, grasping at any shred of justification. Wallace pressed forward, undeterred. "And wasn't it also true, Ms. Greene, that Mr. Cole's response was not a premeditated assault, but rather a reflexive defense against your aggression?" Samantha hesitated, her eyes darting to her lawyer for reassurance. The cracks in her story deepened as Wallace leaned in. "Answer the question, Ms. Greene," Wallace said firmly, her tone unwavering. Samantha lowered her gaze, her voice now subdued. "I told you it was a reaction," she admitted reluctantly. Wallace nodded. "So, you admit that Mr. Cole didn't initiate the physical altercation, he merely responded to being attacked?" Before Samantha could attempt to recover, Wallace addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I request to call a witness who can clarify the nature of the interaction Ms. Greene referred to." Moments later, Daniel Foster, a middle-aged man who had been in the parking lot that day, took the stand. Wallace directed him with precise questions. "Please state your name for the court," she said. "Daniel Foster," he replied. "Mr. Foster, you witnessed the incident between Mr. Cole and Ms. Greene, correct?" Wallace asked. "Yes, I saw the entire thing," Daniel confirmed. "Can you describe what you observed during the physical altercation?" Wallace continued. Daniel took a breath before replying. "Ms. Greene approached Mr. Cole, yelling at him. I couldn't hear all of it, but it was obvious she was furious. Then she shoved him, and when he didn't respond, she slapped him, hard. That's when Mr. Cole slapped her back, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't aggressive. It seemed like he was just trying to stop her from hitting him again." Wallace leaned forward, addressing the jury with deliberate clarity. "Would you say Mr. Cole's response was more a defensive reaction than an attempt to escalate the situation?" "Absolutely," Daniel replied without hesitation. "It was light, almost reflexive. He didn't want to hurt her, just protect himself." Wallace turned back to the jury. "What we've heard from Mr. Foster, neutral witness, confirms that Mr. Cole acted not out of aggression, but solely in defense of himself against Ms. Greene's attack." Samantha's lawyer shifted uneasily, sensing the momentum slipping away. Wallace returned to her seat, composed and confident as the room sat in silence, the jury absorbing every word. As the judge called for a brief recess, Desmond stood and stretched, the tension weighing on him not entirely eased. Anticipation mingled with unease as he thought about the closing arguments and what was to come. When court reconvened, both sides presented their final statements. Wallace was sharp, precise, and unrelenting, leaving no room for doubt about Samantha's guilt. Meanwhile, Samantha's lawyer made another attempt to appeal to emotion, urging the jury to consider the human side of Samantha's actions, framing her outburst as an unfortunate but isolated lapse in judgment. But Desmond knew the truth. This wasn't about humanity or bad days, it was about justice, plain and simple. The hours that followed felt agonizingly long as the jury deliberated. Finally, they returned, the courtroom falling silent as the foreperson stood. The jury fined the defendant, Samantha Greene, guilty of assault and property damage, the foreperson declared. Samantha's face paled, her hands trembling in her lap as the weight of the verdict bore down on her. For Desmond, the words were a release. He exhaled deeply, a sense of relief washing over him. not just because of the verdict, but because he had stood his ground. He had proven to himself and to others that he would not be silenced or degraded by people like her. As the courtroom emptied, Desmond remained seated for a moment, letting the reality of the verdict sink in. Samantha had been found guilty, but the quiet unease in his chest persisted. The oppressive weight of that day in the parking lot had begun to lift, yet the scars, both literal and emotional, remained. This victory wasn't just about winning a case. It was about reclaiming a piece of his dignity, about resisting the forces that tried to dehumanize him. As he finally stood and walked out, the whispers of the departing crowd faded into the background. He stepped into the open air, the cool breeze brushing against his face. But instead of feeling triumphant, he was left with a sobering truth. Samantha represented something far bigger than herself. Her entitlement, her malice, her belief in her own invincibility, they were symptoms of a larger sickness, one that wouldn't disappear with a guilty verdict. And as much as Desmond wanted to feel peace, he knew the battle was far from over. Yes, the courtroom had delivered its verdict, but Samantha represented far more than just one individual's hatred. Her entitlement, her belief that she could treat Desmond as less simply because of his race, reflected a deeper, systemic issue. A guilty verdict couldn't erase the sting of that reality. Desmond felt the weight of it pressing on him as he stepped out of the courthouse. The cool breeze brushed his face, but it brought no relief. He paused on the steps, inhaling deeply, trying to find peace within himself, yet the anger simmered just below the surface. Why did people like Samantha exist? Her actions weren't just impulsive. They were rooted in a kind of malice that seemed endless. This wasn't just about her slap or her insults. It was about something that lingered far longer than words, a quiet, pervasive racism that seeped into daily life, cutting deep in ways others couldn't always see. Desmond couldn't stop replaying the moments in his mind, the shouting, the mocking, the escalation to violence. Samantha had looked at him not as an equal, but as someone she could degrade with impunity. And the worst part? She wasn't alone. Her mindset wasn't unique, it was widespread, lurking in subtle glances, muttered words, and overt acts like hers. She had acted as though there would be no consequences for her actions, as if the system would protect her. That confidence was what sickened Desmond the most. People like her moved through life with ease, spewing hatred without thought or care, while people like him bore the brunt of it. Her entitlement had drained him emotionally, but her lack of remorse during the trial revealed just how ingrained such behavior truly was. Desmond's thoughts drifted to the stories he had heard growing up, his parents recounting moments of humiliation, his friends sharing experiences of being treated as less. He'd lived it too. The suspicious stares, the hesitant interactions, the thinly veiled prejudice. But Samantha's actions had gone further. She had physically attacked him, fully confident she could walk away unscathed. That slap wasn't just about a parking spot. It was a reminder of how society often allowed people like her to thrive unchecked. Desmond clenched his fists as the memory stung anew. It wasn't just his cheek that had been struck. It was his dignity, his right to exist without being questioned or belittled. Samantha had made it clear that, to her, he was lesser, and the system she relied on to shield her reinforced that belief. A soft voice pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Wallace, the prosecutor, approached him with a small smile, her demeanor both professional and kind. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. Desmond shrugged, exhaustion evident in his posture. "I'm relieved, I guess," he replied, "but it doesn't feel like a victory." Wallace nodded knowingly. "Cases like this often feel bittersweet. It's not just about the verdict, is it?" Desmond shook his head. "It's not. People like her don't just go away. Samantha probably still thinks she did nothing wrong. And there are so many more like her. It's frustrating." His voice cracked slightly, revealing the emotional toll. Wallace gave him a sympathetic look. "Unfortunately, you're right. The system can't change what people like her believe. But what you did today mattered. Standing up for yourself matters, even if it doesn't feel like it now," she said firmly. Desmond gave a tired smile, nodding in quiet appreciation. "Thanks for everything," he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "Of course," Wallace replied, her tone reassuring. "And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." As she walked away, Desmond stood alone on the courthouse steps, the weight of everything settling in once more. He began making his way to his car, the same car tied to that fateful confrontation. Its exterior had been repaired, the scratches and dents erased, yet every time he looked at it, the memory of Samantha's malice resurfaced. Sliding into the driver's seat, he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him appeared drained, worn down by a lifetime of fighting for something as basic as respect. Samantha wasn't the entire problem. She was a symptom of a much larger issue. Racism wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a constant embedded in the fabric of everyday life. It showed itself in small, nearly imperceptible ways, like hesitation in a stranger's gaze, or the way a cashier's smile stiffened when he handed over cash. But then it exploded, as it had with Samantha, into overt hatred and violence. Desmond gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. The truth hit him hard. This was his reality. People like Samantha weren't going anywhere. The system might hold one individual accountable, but it couldn't erase the entitlement and malice that gave her confidence in the first place. He started the car, exhaling deeply as the engine hummed. Driving through the city, the buildings blurred in his peripheral vision while his thoughts raced. Yes, Samantha had been found guilty, but the verdict hadn't erased the pain. It felt less like a victory and more like surviving another skirmish in a never-ending war. The sadness gripped him sharply, a reminder that Samantha wasn't an anomaly. People like her reappeared again and again, wielding their prejudice like a weapon. Desmond knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd face such hatred, and that truth hung over him like a storm cloud, heavy and relentless. When he finally pulled into his driveway, his body ached with exhaustion, both physical and mental. He turned off the engine but remained seated for a moment, the stillness of the car providing a fragile sense of calm. Wallace's words echoed in his mind. Standing up for yourself matters. Maybe it did. Maybe pushing back against people like Samantha was the only way to keep moving forward. But at that moment, all Desmond craved was peace, freedom from the fight, freedom from the constant need to prove his worth. As he stepped out of the car and headed to his front door, the faint relief of Samantha's accountability flickered inside him. Yet, the bitterness of the ordeal lingered. He knew it would take time for his anger at the world to fade, but for now, he had done all he could. And for now, that had to be enough.